Dr. Usman, when we are talking about Special Investment Facilitation Council, how much it helped actually to create business and investment friendly climate, along with that offering incentives, ending all bottlenecks and particularly the bureaucratic hurdles?
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be on your show. Sir, you've asked a very pertinent question again, and that is, has SIFC helped with the red tapeism, the stuff? Best way to assess that is to look at how the ease of doing business rankings hold up for countries. And in recent times, Pakistan's ease of business ranking is roughly flat, which is to say that it has not reflected the changes being made, if they're being made, are not reflected in the ease of business ranking, which is an international ranking that takes local data. So that's the first consideration. The second is that is SIFC a replacement for your typical ministries? If it isn't, then the bottlenecks still exist because the way the bureaucracy is structured, it presents a lot of bottlenecks for any serious international investor. Plus the point about policy continuity that was mentioned just now, which is true. So if those things still exist and the NOC culture still exists, that means that it would still be considerably difficult for a slightly large investor to come. So I'm not speaking of government to government, but anything slightly large private sector, which has an enormous ocean of capital, for them to come, the SIFC alone would not solve it, at least if the current system is still also intact at the same time. So that's what I would present to you as a consideration.
So when we are talking about SIFC, to what extent would be handy in scaling up the foreign direct investment into the country, especially from the Gulf region, and how it is related to the domestic investments as well?
Insofar as you do government to government, it is possible for the Gulf monarchies, for example, to sign off on deals and to shift capital because those decisions are made at the monarchy level. That's fine. But insofar as you have private sector, whether it is overseas Pakistanis, whether it is domestic Pakistanis, whether it is private sector multinational corporations, they would still not have the same facilitation that they would expect as they would receive in other emerging markets of roughly the same size, such as Vietnam, Colombia, Bangladesh, etc. So we should always keep in mind our peer competitors, and our peer competitors are working very hard. So Bangladesh and Colombia and Vietnam and other such countries are working very hard. So it's a very competitive market out there for capital. And capital itself has receded considerably since 2022, since interest rates were increased. That means that there is less capital floating around. You have to therefore be even more competitive than usual in attracting capital. It just doesn't mean higher returns. It also means a secure environment. It also means the consistency of policy. It means all of the factors that are put into the ease of business doing ranking. So this is a very complex process. And that's why my fundamental request to you would be that we have hardcore, serious economists running this aspect of the economy. It would only make sense, would it not? Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. You are absolutely right. Dr. Usman, when we are talking about to build economy on the basis of foreign investments particularly, so how do you see the economic diplomacy and engagement with the other capitals through your diplomatic missions to bring this foreign investment which is direly needed to Pakistan really?
Thank you very much for this question. I agree with all of the comments made by my dear colleague, Dr. Hassan. And insofar as our missions are concerned, our consulates abroad, we have commercial consulates in many missions, but they struggle with being able to promote what Pakistan produces, fundamentally because it doesn't produce much of interest to those markets. That means to say that in terms of, and I mean that empirically, in terms of economic complexity, Pakistan is a very low complexity, especially for a country of its size. Because if you look at our export base, it is limited to very specific tiers of either primary commodities or secondary manufacturing for household non-durables, which is your towels, your apparel, and things like that. There is only so many towels that you will buy in a year, for example. How could our missions promote something that we don't produce? So that's the first limitation. One great eminent ambassador of Pakistan once said that no ambassador is larger than his country. And the same applies for economic diplomacy. where yes, you have very capable diplomats working on many different fronts, but insofar as even commerce ministry officials going abroad, DMG officials going abroad, they don't necessarily have that expertise as commercial counselors in those areas, so they just use those postings. They're not seasoned career diplomats necessarily, and even if they were, they wouldn't have much to show. So economic diplomacy, you see a better mechanism for this in some countries where they merge foreign affairs and trade. Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, for example, because there's so much synergy. So New Zealand does that, for example, or Australia or other countries where they merge it so deeply that trade and diplomacy go hand in hand throughout the processes from the top of government. If we were to do that, you would already see an improvement on the bureaucracy side because you have, mashallah, always had a very capable foreign office. And even in other ministries, you do have capable people, but
So
you
do
have
you
so
think
many.
that with Mr. Ishaq Dar as a foreign minister, there would be any impact within the foreign ministry?
That depends on what your perception is of his economic expertise. So that's not something that I'm particularly ready to comment on, because I would like somebody to have control over and preside over ministries where we have at least four that work on things that are in the same ambit: planning, finance, commerce, as well as a board of investment and trade. Why do you have so many things looking at the same area of promoting in the exports? You would rather have the private sector consortia working on finding this. And you know what? I'm not a person who blames government for everything. I think the private.
By the way, yesterday Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has categorically said when he was addressing to the cabinet meeting, and he said that there are lots of institutes and organizations and ministries which we don't need actually. So this is very important really. You are absolutely right. Dr. Usman, when we are talking about the foreign investments, unfortunately Pakistan is posting only 13.6% to the GDP when we are talking about investments as compared to the regional average of 34%, because in South Asia Pakistan is the lowest. So what's the reason behind why we are lagging?
It's a very good point. You have some very high investment ratios in Asia as a whole. So Bangladesh would be above 20%. China is at 40% because of peculiarities of their economy. So it's probably not a reasonable benchmark to look at Asia. Asia is quite particular. But if you look at the world standards, Pakistan's investment rate is too low for a emerging market. And what that implies is that Pakistanis don't think about tomorrow. Right, because investment means you withhold current consumption to have something for future consumption. That's what investment is. So what you really need is to push the investment rate higher. Now, the points that have been raised earlier by my dear colleague, by you, and by myself all point towards having a more sustainable and continuity of policy in order to drive investment over a larger horizon. It means that our leadership needs to start thinking about horizons that are much longer than their tenures. The typical tenure would be 5 years, and instead you have to think of 30 years and 50 years. So intergenerational thinking and having the policy frameworks that you expect Pakistan to be at this juncture and that juncture over much larger horizons will drive investment rates. And
so if you just briefly tell us that this 22% of the policy rate, it is also a hurdle for the foreign investors to invest in Pakistan, because they are in a dwindling situation, that how they are going to have some sort of capital investment and capital availability as well.
You're absolutely right. That is a very good point. So if your base rate, your discount rate is 22%, then you have to earn at least 30% return on investment to earn in excess of inflation and interest rate and a risk premium. You have all of these tiers of risks to overcome and then have a return in order to have a viable prospect. But how many businesses can you count that can produce a 30% return continuously? It is very unusual. It's usually because of a monopoly or a market distortion. But in normal markets, which have many participants, it is very difficult to earn 30%. And that's why you have to have a lower discount rate to promote investment in business rather than parking the money in the banks, because you're getting 22% for free doing nothing. You might as well sit and do nothing at 22%. That's the distortion created.
Your point well taken, Dr. Usman. Dr. Usman, earlier Dr. Hassan was talking about the special economic zones and special industrial zones must have to be set up. Those are very much necessary to attract the foreign direct investment into the country. So how do you see this scenario if Pakistan has the plans to set up these zones, but unfortunately very lazy work on that, or might be very slow?
You're correct on that, on your appraisal of the SEZs. You know, special economic zones apply a form of discrimination where you have the mainstream economy and then you have a special economy. So it discriminates between the mainstream and the special. It makes sense in a country where the mainstream economy has some serious distortions, such as China did in the Maoist era. So they created special zones where they would have different rules. Now, in Pakistan, I wouldn't want our normal economic activity to be disadvantaged as opposed to a special economic zone which would have privileges. I would actually like our mainstream economy to do very well, and therefore I'm not so keen on it. But if you do have special economic zones, they have to be the ones that have an indigenous demand, that they address special things in the market, or that they are very export driven. So they have to have special purposes in order to move forward.
As Hanan said, that no doubt that Pakistan's labor force, along with that particularly the youth, they are unfortunately underutilized. Most of them are might be not properly skilled or educated. So we have more than 63% of the youth, and when we are talking about the foreign direct investment in the country, it is obvious to have that helps to grow, particularly the industrial base, having more growth and resultantly have different sort of jobs. So how do you see that engaging youth in the labor force and all others, even women and all that, so that we have a bunch of human resource and then develop it according to different industries? When the investment comes, they utilize their expertise into that.
I fully agree with you, Faisal Saab. The youth is our greatest asset. The youth has to be adapted to the modern demands, and the modern demands change considerably, decade after decade, year after year, to be honest. So if our youth is well poised for the international arena, that means that we would have a significant advantage. Even without industrial manufacturing, you would already have the key resource required for the modern era. Our young people are extremely capable, and even in adverse economic conditions, they are creating opportunities for themselves, such as in the freelancing industry. But what you really need now is to channel that and galvanize that at a large scale, because this asset can find its own way, it is true, but it is much more helpful to have them channeled towards a significant advancement in the development of their human capital, targeted towards the main areas that are required. The Gulf was mentioned, but I also think that IT and remote working and other things means that you can also be based in Pakistan and develop significant economic gains for the young people, so that they have good incomes and they are competing. There's plenty of possibilities on that front, but let us never discount the importance of the youth and give them the space and give them the capital to drive the next generation of Pakistan's economic prospects.
Obviously, you are absolutely right on that account.